And in the same way that I wouldn't ask the United States Senate or the American people to sign off on something before they've actually seen the details of it, and given that I'm not going to sign off on any deal until I've seen the details of it, I wouldn't expect them to either. What I did hear from our GCC partners was their agreement that if we can get a comprehensive, verifiable deal that cuts off the pathways to a nuclear weapon, that would be in their interests and the interests of the region as well as the world community. And so the question is then going to be, is Iran prepared to do what's required for the international community to feel confidence that, in fact, it's not developing a nuclear weapon? And have we set up the kinds of inspection regimes that allow such confidence to be maintained, not just next year or 5 years from now, but out into the future? So what we did was we had Secretary Kerry, Secretary Ernie Moniz, who obviously was involved in negotiations as well, to walk through why it was that we were confident that if the framework agreement we've arrived at were to be solidified, that in fact we could verify that they did not have a nuclear weapon, and that was important to them, and I think gave them additional confidence. There was a concern that I share, that even if we deal effectively with the nuclear issue, that we will still have a problem with some of Iran's destabilizing activities. And a number of them did express the concern that with additional resources through the reduction in sanctions, that was it possible that Iran would siphon off a lot of these resources into more destabilizing activity. Secretary Jack Lew was there to explain that, first of all, there would be no sanctions relief until we could confirm that Iran had actually carried out its obligations under any nuclear deal. Secondly, we gave them our best analysis of the enormous needs that Iran has internally and the commitment that Iran has made to its people in terms of shoring up its economy and improving economic growth. And as I pointed out, most of the destabilizing activity that Iran engages in is low-tech, low-cost activity. And so part of my emphasis to them was that if we are focusing more effectively on the things we need to do to shore up defenses, improve intelligence, improve the capacity for maritime monitoring of what's taking place in the Gulf, if we are working in concert to address the terrorist activity and countering terrorist messages that are coming not just from state sponsors like Iran, but more broadly from organizations like ISIL, then we're going to be able to fortify ourselves and deal with many of these challenges much more effectively, and we can do so from a position of strength and confidence. So it's not to deny the concerns that were there about what happens when sanctions are reduced, but it was to emphasize that what matters more is the things that we can do now to ensure that some of this destabilizing activity is no longer taking place. And of course, when you look at a place like Yemen, the issue there is that the state itself was crumbling, and that if we can do a better job in places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, in building up functioning political structures, then it's less likely that anybody, including Iran, can exploit some of the divisions that exist there. Michael Viqueira.
Thank you, Mr. President. On Syria, one of the reasons we're here is because many of the nations in the region were upset that more than 2 years ago when Bashar al-Assad deployed chemical weapons, there was no military response, as you appeared to promise, no retaliation on the part of the U.S. part. Now there's a possibility that Assad has once again used chemical weapons. What did you tell these leaders here who are disappointed last time? And will you use a military response if it's confirmed that he used chemical weapons again, once again deployed them? And if I could ask a domestic question as well, sir. And this one is about the environment and the drilling that's recently been approved in the Arctic. This nation, the United States, is now a net exporter for the first time in years of fossil fuels, partly due to fracking, something that environmentalists have objected to, something that you regard as an all-of-the-above energy strategy. But the oil company Shell has had a very mixed record of drilling in that region. Many environmentalists look at this and say, is it really worth the risk to drill in such a delicate ecosystem? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Michael, I don't know why you're here, but the reason I'm here is not because of what happened in Syria a couple of years ago. The reason I'm here is because we've got extraordinary challenges throughout the region, not just in Syria, but in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and obviously the development of ISIL, and our interest in making sure that we don't have a nuclear weapon in Iran. With respect to Syria, my commitment was to make sure that Syria was not using chemical weapons and mobilizing the international community to assure that that would not happen. And in fact, we positioned ourselves to be willing to take military action. The reason we did not was because Assad gave up his chemical weapons. And that's not speculation on our part. That, in fact, has been confirmed by the organization internationally that is charged with eliminating chemical weapons. And I don't think that there are a lot of folks in the region who are disappointed that Assad is no longer in possession of one of the biggest stockpiles of chemical weapons of any country on earth. Those have been eliminated. It is true that we've seen reports about the use of chlorine in bombs that have the effect of chemical weapons. Chlorine itself historically has not been listed as a chemical weapon, but when it is used in this fashion, can be considered a prohibited use of that particular chemical. And so we're working with the international community to investigate that. And in fact, if we have the kinds of confirmation that we need, we will once again work with the international community and the organization charged with monitoring compliance by the Syrian government, and we will reach out to patrons of Assad like Russia to put a stop to it. With respect to the situation in the Arctic, I think it's fair to say that I know a little something about the risks of offshore drilling, given what happened in the Gulf very early in my presidency. And so nobody's more mindful of the risks involved and the dangers. That's why, despite the fact that Shell had put in an application for exploration in this region several years ago, we delayed it for a very lengthy period of time until they could provide us with the kinds of assurances that we have not seen before, taking account of the extraordinary challenges if, in fact, there was a leak that far north and in that kind of an environment, which would be much more difficult to deal with than in the Gulf. Based on those very high standards, Shell had to go back to the drawing board, revamp its approach, and the experts at this point have concluded that they have met those standards. But keep in mind that my approach when it comes to fracking, drilling, U.S. energy production of oil or natural gas has remained consistent throughout. I believe that we are going to have to transition off of fossil fuels as a planet in order to prevent climate change. I am working internationally to reduce our carbon emissions and to replace, over time, fossil fuels with clean energies. Obviously, we started home with all the work that we've done to, for example, double the use of clean energy. But I think that it is important also to recognize that that is going to be a transition process. In the meantime, we are going to continue to be using fossil fuels, and when it can be done safely and appropriately, U.S. production of oil and natural gas is important. I would rather us, with all the safeguards and standards that we have, be producing our oil and gas rather than importing it, which is bad for our people, but is also potentially purchased from places that have much lower environmental standards than we do. Tolu.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to ask you about trade.
Yeah.
The Senate moved forward on a bill today to approve your trade legislation, and it also moved forward with a proposal to punish countries like China for what they do in terms of manipulating their currency. Could you potentially see yourself accepting Senator Schumer's language on currency manipulation, or would you have to veto that? And secondly, could you also talk about your relationship with Senator Warren? Do you regret the fact that things have become so personal with the back and forth on trade? And then secondly, if I could ask...
Wait, that was the second question, wasn't it? So now thirdly is what you're saying.
Yes, just
okay.
Really quickly, you mentioned the issue of a two-state solution with Israel. I was wondering if you would give your reaction to what the Pope is moving forward with in terms of recognizing the Palestinian state. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think it's a mistake? And do you think it might help or hinder the two-state solution that you mentioned earlier?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate the Senate on moving forward on providing me the authority to not only strike a smart, progressive, growth-promoting trade deal with some of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region and potentially in Europe as well, but also to give me the tools to enforce those agreements, which haven't always happened in the past. So I want to thank all the senators who voted to provide that authority, or at least to begin the debate on moving that process forward. Those who didn't vote for it, I want to keep on trying to make the case and provide them the information they need to feel confident that despite the fact that there have been very genuine problems with some trade deals in the past, the approach that we're taking here, I think, is the right one, not just for big U.S. businesses, but also for small U.S. businesses and medium-sized U.S. businesses, and most importantly, ultimately, American workers. I would not be promoting any agreement that I didn't think, at the end of the day, was going to be creating jobs in the United States and giving us more of an opportunity to create ladders of success, higher incomes, and higher wages for the American people, because that's my primary focus. It has been since I came into office. The issue with respect to myself and Elizabeth has never been personal. I mean, I think it's fun for the press to see if we can poke around at it when you see two close allies who have a disagreement on a policy issue. But there are a whole bunch of some of my best friends in the Senate, and as well in the House, some of my earliest supporters who disagree with me on this. And I understand, because like me, they came up through the ranks watching plants close, jobs being shipped overseas. Like me, they have concerns about whether labor agreements or environmental agreements with other countries are properly enforced. Like me, they have concerns about whether, in fact, trade ends up being fair and not just free. And like me, they have a deep concern about some of the global trends that we've seen and trends that we've seen in our own countries in terms of increased inequality and what appears to be the effects of automation and globalization in allowing folks at the very top to do really, really well, but creating stagnation in terms of incomes and wages for middle-class families and folks working to get their way into the middle class. So